I have talked in previous shows about this civil war of ideologies, and this began, as many historians assert, if you really look back in the traces of these two ideologies, it began basically at the time of Adam. I mean, Adam may not have had a government, but it didn't take long for enough people to exist for government to be needed, and or rules and laws and those types of things, and how they governed themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean they had the intricate government of policies and all these laws and so forth, but they did have God's law. At least a lot of historians don't necessarily acknowledge that. But here's an interesting thing, and I'm going to go on a tangent here. If you look into the history of Egypt, ancient Egypt, they actually chronicalized and they captured the history of ancient man. And when I say ancient man, man before the flood, before the acknowledged flood of ancient Samaria, I think it was. I'm bad with names, but anyway, the Egyptians actually documented their belief systems and so forth. And so we will get back to what I want to say as soon as we get back from the break. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Thank you very much. About Adam and the doctrine, or the civil war of doctrines, because truly, liberty was the original doctrine that Adam and his ancestors beheld. I'll even say this, that I think there was this commandment or law that said something about man must live by the sweat of, I think it's his brow, not another man's brow. And it didn't take long, because the annals of history record that slavery actually started well before the flood. I mean, it's been around for over 5,000 years. And so it didn't take long for people to figure out. And as a matter of fact, we see it today. People start figuring out, oh, well, you know what, if I can take advantage of these people, because lots of people accuse corporations of doing slavery, and lots of people can, accuse other individuals of slave labor with their children and so forth. But nobody ever points the finger at the government for creating slavery and creating programs that literally entice them to become enslaved to these programs, to these handouts and gaming and so forth. And there's been plenty of documented evidence that proves that there's many people that are stuck on the dole of government. Because I remember seeing an expose where a lady in Ohio was basically saying she would need to get a job that paid a base salary of over $80,000 for her to get off of her gravy train. And she said that she's just not incentivized in doing that. She would love to do that, but that's how hard it would take and how much money she would need to bring in to replace her current lifestyle. And so the question is, if she's got this lifestyle as a handout from the government, and all these people on the dole, some are, on a greater dole than others. I've known people that have gone on the dole just because bad events occur and they work their way out of that as quickly as possible, because they're not looking to game the system. They have, what we used to have in this country is pride and self dignity and respect, self-respect. And there was just no way a self-respecting person would allow themselves to take free handouts. It's one thing to not take a handout because you're in need, but it's another thing to just take a handout and keep taking that handout. And I think that's where that self-respect kicked in. And as a matter of fact, Ward Connerly in his book, he talked about that as regarding his mother. Because he grew up with that self-respecting mind model. And then I think it was later with his, I think it was his grandmother in his book, Creating Equal. If you read it, it's a good book. It gives you some insight on, his background and his history. But he talks about this concept of putting aside your self-respect and dignity in taking this, because this concept that you deserve it. And that's where we get this kind of concept of entitlement. Anyway, as Adam and this slavery, and I'm going to skim over 5,000 years, or almost that, about 4,000 years, slavery became just a normal part of everyday life. And so the dawn of enlightenment that set the stage for our republic, and this is why this is so important, is the Magna Carta, because that was truly the beginning of men and the society, men in a society, a very specific society, the British society, where they put their feet down and said, look, we have individual rights and we demand that you sign this document and, acknowledge the fact that we have these rights. King John signed that, and it didn't take long for those encroachments to occur. And so what did they end up having? They had the Glorious Revolution back in I think it was the 1680s, which was about a century before our revolution. But the interesting thing, though, at about that same time, or I would say a century before the the Glorious Revolution, was this new thing that came out of this individual freedom, because this individual freedom drove people to want to know and possess knowledge for themselves. And guess what? That one thing was the Bible and the printing of the Bible, the canonizing of the Bible, which I believe the canonizing was 1546, something like that. And so the Magna Carta, that was 300 years before that. So people started, growing into this idea that I have my own freedom or levels of freedom and sovereignty that I can choose for myself in a light respect, because again, the crown started encroaching upon that. But when the Bible came out, it started teaching these concepts in everybody's hands instead of having it in control, because we know that the monarchies and their entanglement with states were basically kind of holding and controlling people at bay. And so embedded deep in this recess of enlightenment was this concept of overcoming the practice of slavery and just the concept of slavery. And so why is this important? Is because we are all allowing progressives to ram down our throats the concept of privilege and distorting our real history. If you've never read my book, you probably should, because I kind of cover all of this. And some really good books that get into the micro would be Thomas Sowell's book on black rednecks and white liberals, or W. Cleon Skousen's book about the 5,000-year leap, a miracle of mankind, or whatever. Those are all available on Amazon. It is always important, as I said before, to keep our eyes and keep looking at things in the big picture, in the macro view. And when we start zooming in on very specific events, that's when we start getting tunnel vision and we start looking at things from a very micro perspective. And so when people start talking about white privilege and or privilege period, one would think, well, shoot, that's here in America. No, it's not. As a matter of fact, privilege is a part of society. As a matter of fact, if you look throughout all time, inheritance has always been a part of life. It's biblical. It goes that far back. And so what country in the world doesn't have inheritance and establishments of privilege or what have you? What country out there has the foundation that's set on, and nobody gets anything other than possibly Russia and communism, where when you die, the state comes in and they take away all of that because you're not entitled to have state property. But that's the concept of communism, which is supposedly the new era of, this utopian society, but actually it's a very oppressive society, and history's only proven that. I mean, look at the Russians. There's the elitists that live just fine, and then there are the minions that work and slave, and as long as they can keep the minions happy, then they're good. They're going to do what they're told, and it's important that we do what we're told, and that's what we're doing here in America today. We need to break that, and we need to get back to our fundamental principles and standards that the framers used, which was that individual liberty and individual sovereignty. So if you look at how long it took from the Magna Carta to the establishment of our revolution, that was 560 years, something like that. And throughout time, it's been monarchical theocracies that have tossed mankind from liberty to and fro, from subjugation to a little bit of freedom, subjugation, and so forth. Never has there ever been a time that allowed people their own right of conscience and all the rights that the framers put in place for us. And this is all setting the stage for this republic that they actually created, which required a common people with a common belief system to do the impossible. And I'm telling you, it was a miracle of what happened back in the times of the Constitutional Convention. And with this music in my ear, it looks like we're heading into a hard break, so I'm going to keep this up when we get right back after a word from our sponsor. A little overview of how disparate and different each of the colonies were. And so the question one must ask is, what was it that got these colonies, these disparate colonies, to recognize what was going on, to coalesce, and to mobilize a revolt? And so let's kind of look at this at the macro, or you can go into the micro and go, well, okay, so they had this Tea Party, right? And they had this thing called the Stamp Acts and the Intolerable, I think they were the Intolerable Acts, and the Stamp Act was one of those. And so if you look at the amount of money that they were being taxed, in contrast to today, I commonly, when I walked amongst my Marine brethren and others, I would always, walk into the room and go, who has been pissing in the gene pool? Forgive the expression there, but who's been doing this to get us to completely forget this concept of taxation without representation? Does anybody understand how much they were being taxed and why these people revolted against that? It was 0.1% that tea tax was. 0.1% of their income, and they considered it intolerable. And so, what the heck happened? I will tell you what happened. It's been manipulation, and it has been the soothsaying of lawyers, politicians, bureaucrats, and judges and so forth, and basically pushing forward a very secular progressive agenda. And the interesting thing is, because most Christians would, point their finger straight to Satan and say, Satan's behind all this. And of course, but the question is, was there a grand conspiracy? Nah, it's just been the way people kind of have this. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing is this question was also asked between Alexander the Great and Aristotle. And Alexander the Great wanted to know why societies and people constantly fell for this concept of creating a socialistic or communistic society. That's not what they called it back then. As a matter of fact, Plato, when he wrote his Republic, was the first time it was ever really pinned to the statist ideology where the state controlled every facet of your life. And Aristotle, I believe the response was something to the effect that innate within everybody, we understand the family, a mother, father, the love of the family, and so forth. And innate within everybody, they just have this desire to expand that to a community and to a greater level, to the national level or the state level as what they knew. And back in those days, they were pretty isolated by distance between, Athens, Egypt, and so forth. So that was their world. It wasn't like they had interstate commerce and the ability to communicate. I mean, it took a long time to get to another place. And they're in between these places, from Athens and Rome and so forth. They started creating way stations or little towns and cities, and those popped up. And then they created their own little state government. And that kind of explains why we have Europe as the hodgepodge that it is. And it also explains in a macro view why Europe needed to expand, is because they were running out of space for agricultural growth and those types of things. So anyway, what was it that they recognized, coalesced, and mobilized their revolt? They recognized the fact that they were losing their liberties and that they had no representation in this form of government. They didn't have any representation for their state or their regional area in Parliament, and they were, basically saying, you need to give us representation. That wasn't happening. And in the macro view, it wasn't very realistic to think that you could actually travel from the colonies and be in Parliament and feel like you're really being represented, because how long did it take for a letter to get there? How long did it take for any communications? It's not like they had SATCOM. It's not like they had texting. No, it sometimes took 2 seasons. I mean, I guess the average wait was somewhere a little over a month for a letter to get from one end to the other. But by the time you heard back from that other person, it could take 2 months. But during the wintertime, travel was hindered by weather and so forth. And so it was constantly it wasn't very dynamic. It was very long waiting processes of trying to find out what we're going to do and so forth. I mean, when Thomas Jefferson sent the Marines over to Tripoli, he did that long before he really knew and before he told Congress that he was sending them. And so he knew that it took time to do that. So he just made an executive decision, and he felt that that was within his scope. And so that has really grown a lot since then, hasn't it? But those days, getting information was very timely, and it was very costly sometimes in not having that information in a timely manner. So from that revolution period where people were saying, hey, we don't have any representation, to the Constitution period, things changed very quickly, because they went from a confederacy of full autonomy practically, which required 100% of the states to make any type of change to their government, to give the government any more powers or anything. And they said, well, shoot, we can't do this, because back in those days, the Confederacy was trapped. It couldn't tax, it couldn't do anything. And so if you understand, how this Confederacy was literally going to collapse, the brilliancy was that those people understood what they were going through. Madison had been working years trying to deal with this Confederacy. And I say probably 2-3 years. He was writing letters and getting people to finally recognize, hey, look, there's states that aren't going to be able to pay their debt. There's people that's going to start revolting. Shea Rebellion up in Massachusetts was a big part of getting Washington moving forward towards the Constitutional Convention. So we cannot marginalize the exigencies of the time. It was very urgent, because they recognized that Britain, France, and Spain, with their avarice and machinations of control, were literally waiting in the wings for us to fail, so they come in and save us and put us under their wing again. And so whenever I hear anybody referring to the Constitutional Convention as a runaway convention, I'm basically looking at that person that's saying that, and I'm going, I don't think that person really either understands what they did and the integrity of these men that did this, or I think we're just looking at somebody that's trying to marginalize and sell a bill of goods. Now, to be clear, if you read the Federalist Papers and if you read the ratification debates, Madison talks about and I said this before, how he's copied almost verbatim parts of the Articles of Confederation went straight into the Constitution. They changed the form, they changed the layout, but the construct was very, very similar, and the concepts were very similar. Some of the things that literally did change, though, was the threshold of what it would take to make an amendment so that the federal government could do something else, to assume a new power. And so let me kind of give you a Federalist paper. And this is James Madison, Federalist Paper number 14. And I want you to understand this, because in light of the State of the Union last night, I want you to think about this before we go into break, or at least think about this during break. And this is what he says. In the first place, it is to be remembered that the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects which concern all the members of the republic, but which are not to be attained by the separate provisions of any. So, in other words, the federal government's limited to what is been placed into this enumerated powers of the Constitution. And so when you listen to the State of the Union, when you start looking at the federal government, go, where in the Constitution did they get this power to create health care? Or the power to create the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy? If you start going through, you will find 12 executive departments that you will not find within that Constitution. So where did they get this? And it's clear that through the Constitution, they were limited to that. And the only way they were going to be able to save that was by amending the Constitution. That was the vehicle and process. And these people stuck to this and that concept, because that's what got us the Bill of Rights. They didn't just, reopen the Constitution. They amended it through the proper process that they gave us. So, as I was talking before we went into the break about the Federalist Paper number 14 by James Madison, and also talking about what happened to our gene pool due to the fact that our framers, and in their time, they stood up for 0.1% tax and no taxation, or the principle of taxation without representation. I've talked about republicanism and how counties have completely lost representation within their own state legislatures, that the voice of the county has been just marginalized completely in our republic, and that is not a Republican form of government. At least the American standard, and why they created the layout of states the way they did, and why states changed their legislative bodies from a unicameral legislative body to a bicameral. So, as I've said before, the framers basically did the impossible, because they were able to put aside their differences. And when I say differences, what does that mean? Well, I've talked a lot about religious differences, but there were social differences between them. As a matter of fact, there were significant social differences between the North to the South. It was a rainbow of social differences, if one might say that. There were economic differences as well. There was lots of lending and so forth, more so in the South. I know that Thomas Jefferson, he bankrolled himself constantly, leveraging and mortgaging and so forth. By the time he died, he was bankrupt. In contrast, in the North, that wasn't just a common behavior. And I know if you've read John Adams by McCullough, in his biography, he talks about, being industrious, being responsible, not taking on debt and all that. And that was a common paradigm of the Puritans, and I would say those northern states. And so their economic and fiscal differences was pretty different. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to make sure that they only delegated the necessary and proper roles to the federal government when they created the Constitution. As I've also said, that the framers were also able to set aside their self-interests. Not one looked into, and as a matter of fact, if you read the journals, there's no journal of somebody saying, you know what, I'm going to be able to create this entity, or I'm going to be able to take advantage by, putting in laws. They didn't have lobbyists like that today. They didn't have corporations that had the avarice of trying to utilize government to take the advantage, and that is atypical in, I think, mankind throughout the ages. But these men were very different. And so the question is, do we have that? Do we have that today to where people recognize where we are? So, as I've said, there's been exigencies that they recognized. Are we not even in a more dire strait and a more dire consequence if we don't fix our problems today than they were back then? The answer is yes, because go look at the debt clock. There are plenty of reasons, and not just financially, there are plenty of reasons and ways we can lose our sovereignty and our independence and our liberty, our Constitution, and our republic. And so it is very important that we start learning what we need to do to protect our individual liberty if you are a lover of individual liberty, being able to do the freedom or have the freedom and do the things that you would like to do in entrepreneurial endeavors and so forth. But back in those times, there was no talk of a cabal. There was no talk of, well, if we did this, then, we could all get rich, or an individual getting rich. It was just, they had no self-interest. And as a matter of fact, even if you look at how those men lived during the convention, there were several men to a given room. They didn't have the Marriotts and these suites and opulence back in those days. These were very humble men, and they were very humble times. And so hopefully we can get our heads right, and so we don't have to go through that level of humility to where we have to try to start fixing by the time it's too late, because there's only one way to fix this, folks, and that is demanding compliance and states leveraging their authority and power, because they possess it. The states possess the power to do this. So going into this Constitutional Convention, things were not equal. As a matter of fact, expectations were not equal. As a matter of fact, the southern states were already kind of weary because the Revolutionary War had already kind of offered freedom, and some of them, took back that freedom, and others were actually given freedom from fighting in the Revolutionary War. But the bottom line is, heading into the convention, slavery in the world was as common as a form of labor as belts holding up pants, holding on shoes, and so forth. Belts were just a common form of holding things up. And so if you've heard that the Constitutional Convention was in a bog down of those first 5 weeks, there was a lot that actually went on. The Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and then the Connecticut Compromise were brought forth in those first 5 weeks. And it took, obviously Benjamin Franklin's call for prayer and those types of things, but they were already addressing in the very beginning the slavery, and the slavery was becoming a greater and hotter issue as the temperatures in Philadelphia started rising, as the plague started rising. People were dying, I believe, that year, and it was just a common thing in the summertime for malaria and all those types of problems. And to think, we have advanced to a point where we don't get malaria and all those problems in Philadelphia anymore. Well, maybe those things will start coming back as well. But anyway, it boiled to a head in August, and that's when the Georgia and Carolinas drew the line and said, basically, if you free slaves, if you make the Constitution dictate to the states that they cannot have slave labor, then we're leaving. And that's also the time when James Madison and George Mason just got livid. And as a matter of fact, George Mason's great quote was, "Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities." So don't forget the original version, as a matter of fact, of the Declaration of Independence, where the ink was dry by this time, but it was very clear that the states were trying to wash their hands of slavery by that document, and it wasn't through Jefferson's desire, but it was through politics and appeasing the South to ensure that those things were cut out. So if you want to understand the paradigm of Jefferson and those, I would say, in Virginia and moving north, other than the big plantation owners that were, basically trying to protect their industry, in Virginia, because most of those people like George Mason and all those were participating in the Declaration of Independence during the Continental Congress. Go read that original draft. Just Google the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Go read those last few paragraphs and you go, oh my gosh, how can they cut that out? I mean, here they were calling on the king for perpetuating this sin upon these colonies and these states. And for some reason, people kind of, ignore those types of facts that, It's not something that we necessarily created, because each of these states were colonized and they had different charters, and the king, and they acknowledged this, the king had these controls and he allowed this to happen. So bottom line, where did slavery really come from? Did it really come from America, as we learn in our textbooks? Did we really invent slavery? Heck no. Where did the word slave come from? Well, if you've read Thomas Sowell's book, the slave came from the word Slav. Well, have you ever heard of the term Slav? Yeah, that's Russian. I will tell you what. I will let you do the research, and I will give to anybody that can call. I've only got a minute left, so I will do this for tomorrow. I will give a set of my books to the caller that can identify the appropriate perpetrator. But again, I will wait till tomorrow to do that. And so if you look at it, slavery was a part of every nation, kindred, and tongue. Even in the nations that were basically abolishing slavery, they were still allowing and recognizing slaves as property, such as Holland and the Northern Europe and so forth. They may have seemed to be noble, but they still acknowledged that that was property, and they allowed that to happen. And so that's why when slave owners went up to these areas, they were able to keep their slaves. And it's the same thing with Massachusetts and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why at that point in time in the Constitution, they still had, because those were the laws of nations. Those were the standards, that property rights were extended, and it was an abomination. And that's why Mason and Madison tried to draw their lines and say, no way, we're not going to do this. I truly wished that they would have had the foresight in seeing the advantage of letting those three states that basically scourged this nation go by themselves, because I truly believe it would have been a matter of a year or two where they would have came back and said, okay, we're getting rid of slavery, because Spain, France, or Britain would have been on them like white on rice, if you can pardon the pun there. But anyway, as we move forward, again, it was for these men about individual liberty and sovereignty, and they did everything they could to try to fix it, and it was a political compromise. And again, I say it was a badly thought out compromise. And so how did we get off track, and how is it that we've gotten all of these problems that, again, we had to have a civil war to really get to where we needed to be? And so with that, I basically want to leave that with you to cogitate, because as you can tell, I'm out of time. And as you can tell, I am going to be back tomorrow at the